members of the clergy, ladies and gentlemen. I want to focus on three areas. One is I want to speak about the IS network in Sri Lanka. I want to speak about the IS network in the region and globally. Then I want to speak to you about how do we respond to a threat like this? What can government do? What can community leaders do? What can educational institutions do? What can religious institutions do? What can others do? What can the ordinary people do? But before I present, I want to pay a tribute to Mr. Alas. And I also want to pay a tribute to your father. I think that you have a great vision, and you're continuing in that vision that was first seeded by your father. And I wish that every school had a similar vision. What we lack today is that vision, and what we lack today is that collective leadership. And when I look at this audience, I feel very proud. I feel that we have suffered a devastating terrorist attack. But I believe, looking at this audience, that we can be stronger and even better if we can work together. Let me present to you that the origins of the Islamic State, the terrorist group that mounted the attack in Sri Lanka, has its genesis in 2014, June 29th, when a terrorist leader called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he declared a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, having captured a city called Mosul. And after that, he captured another city called Raqqa. And he controlled large parts of Syria and Iraq. And he had recruited very young people, European Muslims, Muslims from the Middle East, a few from America and Canada, and some from Asia. But those young Muslims who came to support him to expand and grow the caliphate, they were masters in cyberspace. They had mastery of cyberspace. So they could reach out to very young people, including educated children. So the first wave of Sri Lankans that traveled to Syria and Iraq, and I want to tell you a total of 41 Sri Lankans traveled, they came from two families. One is called the Mushin family, and the other is called the Tajuddin family. They are mostly from the central province, Kandy-centric. And many of them studied at Trinity. It is no reflection on the school. But I want to tell you that they were almost all well educated, and they came from middle class or upper middle class families. These 41 went to Syria and Iraq starting January 5th, 2015. And these 41 Sri Lankans, they traveled through Turkey, which is the gateway to Syria and Iraq. And they served in this organization called the Islamic State. And the leader of this group was a man called Nilam. He also studied at Trinity. Then he went to Pakistan and he did a degree at the International Islamic University. And then he returned back to Sri Lanka, and he was radicalized by his own brother, a man called Ishaq. Ishaq worked for a humanitarian organization in Sri Lanka for many years, and then he went to Tanzania. and then he traveled to Syria and Iraq to provide humanitarian assistance, during which time he got radicalized. Then he went to the UK, so he traveled from the United Kingdom to Sri Lanka and he radicalized his own brother and that entire family and the family of his brother, that is the Tajuddins. So the reason I am telling you this is because I am told that there's a very significant percentage of educators here. So the recruitment of the Islamic State, they are recruiting from 4 interfaces. One is family. Father, mother, children, grandchildren, cousins, nephews, may even recruit grandmother and grandfather, because they present it as a religion, as a duty to God. And I think you can sit there. There are a lot of seats there. So I want to share with you the second interface for recruitment. So one is familial networks. Second is worship, religious worship. So you recruit the imam, the radical imam will recruit his disciples to go and join. So one is familial networks. Second is worship. Another is what you call kinship. And then you also recruit discipleship, teacher recruit student. So this is the interface of recruitment. And I also want to tell you that in the case of the Islamic State, they also recruited from a cross-section of society. That is the rich, the poor, the educated and the less educated. So we have very educated people, even with people with PhDs, masters, who went and joined this group. Education itself is not making our people resilient or immune to the IS ideology, the type of education we have at this point in Sri Lanka. If you are poor, yes. But I want to tell you that looking at the 3 churches that were attacked and the 3 luxury hotels and the other bomber who wanted to attack Taj, his name is Latif, and he perished in the Tropical Inn, very close to the zoo. All of them came from middle class, upper middle class, educated and wealthy families. The profile is different. The only 2 people who were poor, they came from the east. One is Zahran himself, and Zahran also recruited a man called Hashtun. And Hashtun was married to a woman called Pulastini. She is a Sri Lankan Tamil who converted to Islam. They were both in Valachine and in Katankudi. But all the others who joined the network that Zaharan led to stage the Easter Sunday attacks, they came from the Western province. And they were well-to-do families, well-to-do children. That is because the IS recruitment was largely in cyberspace. So cyber is the principal medium for recruitment and radicalization. I'm going to speak to you at length about this, and I want to tell you also the measures we can take to mitigate the threat. And they all believed in an ideology that if you do a terrorist attack against non-Muslims, that you will go to heaven and you will have audience with God or Allah, and you will be forgiven for your sins and vices, and you can take 70 relatives to heaven, and you will also have 72 beautiful girls. But this is the ideology of this group. This is not the religion of Islam. So I want to share with you that groups such as the Islamic State, the groups such as Al-Qaeda, they create their own ideologies which is distinct from the religions. All religious groups, without exception, have produced terrorists. I'll give you examples from each one of those groups. For example, the Buddhists have produced a group called Om Shinrikyo in Japan. They did a sarin attack. Very deadly terrorist group. I myself visited Japan and spoke to people who countered the threat of this group. They recruited brilliant scientists, including from Tokyo University, that could manufacture a range of agents, VX, anthrax, sarin, and they are Buddhists, but distinct from Buddhism, because the Om Shinrikyo leader Soko Asahara, he developed his own ideology, which is a mixture of Buddhism and Hinduism. Similarly, the Jewish terrorist group, the Kakkahane group, they also misinterpreted the Torah. And all of you know what happened in New Zealand, in Christchurch, where again, to a large extent, we saw the misinterpretation of Christianity. We also have a Sikh terrorist group called Babar Khalsa International. They misinterpreted Sikhism. So there's no religion that is not being abused today. In fact, we all have to fight to protect our religions from the fanatics that are being produced, sometimes by our own religious institutions that are not regulated. So I would say that the most important challenge all of you are facing is that we can't have religious freedom anymore. It's an American concept, a European concept. If you want to protect your countries, you can have freedom but with responsibility. It is like expression with responsibility. Don't do what the Americans or the Europeans want. You must do what you want in your own country to protect your national interests. So my view is that the religious sphere must be, it's a very precious, religion is a precious treasure. And we have to protect our religious space. And to do that, we have to have rules and regulations. This is paramount. This can't be only done by religious clergy. Sometimes they are scared of the extremists. So I want to tell you that the Sri Lankan government, the Sri Lankan state must develop the laws, the rules and the regulations to regulate the religious space. I want to elaborate on this towards the end of my presentation, and I want to give you concrete recommendations, what needs to be done. But before that, I want to speak to you a little bit about the genesis, the origins of the Islamic State. The contemporary wave of terrorism by Muslim organizations emerged during the anti-Soviet multinational Afghan Mujahideen campaign that was waged from 79 December to 1989 February. So the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. In response, Pakistan government, General Zia was the leader. He asked Muslim youth to come from around the world to fight against the Soviets. The Americans, the Saudis, and a few other countries, including the British, they assisted the fight. In fact, the Americans specially configured a weapon called the Stinger, and the British gave their blowpipe to the Afghan Mujahideen to fight. They were funded mostly by the Saudis, the Saudi intelligence service. And the man who came from the richest non-royal Saudi family to spearhead the fight of foreign fighters was Osama bin Laden, who later founded a group called Al-Qaeda. That was on August 11th, 1988, just before the Soviets withdrew. And later, Bin Laden dominated Afghanistan together with a local Pakistani group that also recruited their Afghan counterparts called the Taliban. So what happened is when Bin Laden was in Afghanistan, so many fighters went to Afghanistan. No one went from Sri Lanka and no one went from India also. They mostly went from the Arab world. Few non-Arabs went, but none from Sri Lanka. And none went from India also. So I want to share with you that during that time we were very resilient against the call of these terrorist organizations. Because the type of Islam we had in Sri Lanka during that time is what you call Sri Lankan. We had a Sri Lankan Muslim heritage, which is the most precious heritage we have. What the Sri Lankan Muslims have inherited for centuries from their fathers and their forefathers. This Sri Lankan Muslim heritage is in many ways mediated by the Sri Lankan culture. But we saw that after the anti-Soviet multinational Mujahideen campaign in Pakistan, that the ideology that was there in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis very aggressively started to preach their own ideology called Wahhabism. And the Iranians also, they started to preach their version of Islam, mostly Shia. And there's a competition between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they funded so many schools, so many mosques around the world, including in Sri Lanka. And with that, we saw some Sri Lankans travel to the Middle East, and they brought the Middle Eastern version of Islam. So I would say that the genesis of what we saw on Easter Sunday was that. Because that beautiful and local and traditional Islam that we had in Sri Lanka was replaced by a foreign ideology. A foreign ideology. It was a virus that came. I will call it a virus because it doesn't stand well with the Sri Lankan culture. Because what the Muslims had inherited in this country is what came from their forefathers, from their ancestors, that some clergymen threw out for what came from the Middle East with money. They may have even found that ideology attractive. That is the beginning of what you call exclusivism in Sri Lanka. Exclusivism, ladies and gentlemen, leads to something called extremism. And when extremism grows, you may have terrorism. When extremism heightens. And there was a huge misinterpretation of the Quranic texts by those who followed that strain of Islam that came from the Middle East. Islam never reached its peak in the Middle East. Islam, in fact, the greatest civilizations that Islam produced, they are largely in Asia, because 63% of the Muslims, 63% of the world's Muslim population, they live in Asia. And if you ask me, what are the countries that produce the greatest scholars? It's not the West. It was two cities in today's Uzbekistan called Bukhara and Samarkand, where Biruni, the great mathematician, Ibn Sina, the great medical scientist and doctor, Islam brought that civilization. What we see in Europe has many of its origins in the Islamic civilization. The best astronomers, scientists, mathematicians produced from Islam. But it is not the Saudi version of Islam. It's a very sterile version of Islam. Because I have been to Saudi Arabia many times and I have met almost all their leaders. And I have interviewed many terrorists in Saudi Arabia. So I can tell you the different dimensions of Islam in different parts of the world. The most beautiful monuments of Islam are in Central Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in South Asia itself. It's not in the Middle East. But because the religious space was not regulated in Sri Lanka, because the politicians and the secular Muslim leaders and the religious Muslim leaders lacked the leadership. So they brought all these concepts to our country. You can say that is the genesis of the Easter Sunday attacks. So what happened? What you call an ecosystem was created. A radicalization pipeline was created in Sri Lanka. No one can dispute it. No one can dispute it. During Q&A, if any of you dispute it, you can talk to me. And I will speak to you about my own experience of talking to those people who staged that attack and the ideology that is driving them. And I will ask you here that you have to reflect on that period. The period where the IS ideology came is the period from 2014, because IS proclaimed a caliphate June 29th, 2014, and 2015 onwards Sri Lankans started to travel. They are called the foreign terrorist fighters, because there's no group in modern history that has committed so much of atrocities as IS. In fact, they were very famous for beheading, very graphic beheadings. And IS inflicted huge suffering on the Muslim communities. IS has killed more Muslims than any other group in history, because the IS believed in a particular ideology called takfiris. They want to cleanse the Muslim community of people whom they labeled as apostates, apostasy. So within the Muslim community itself, there's a huge fight. The mastermind and the leader of the terrorist attack on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka, Zahran, actually his real name is not Zahran, his real name is Jaharan. If you look at his passport copy, it's called Jaharan. Jaharan, not Hashim. Newspapers report it as Hashim. His second name is Qasim. Jaharan Qasim. But let's call him Zahran, because you got used to calling him Zahran. And I want to tell you that Zahran, he went to what you call a Sufi madrasa in the East. That is a very inclusive strain of Islam. And the Sufis expelled him from that school because he was influenced by that Middle Eastern strain of Islam, which is not conducive for our country. If I may tell you in Sinhala, එක අපේ රටට ගැලපෙන්නේ නැහැ. So Zahran was expelled. Then he went to another school in Nathandia and he completed his degree, which was Arabic college. There also he had some issues. Then with two other clerics, he established another organization And from that organization, he had a fight with those two clerics. And then he created his own organization called National Tawhid Jamaat. There were two other Tawhid Jamaats with the name Tawhid Jamaat operating. One is the Sri Lanka Tawhid Jamaat and the other is the Ceylon Tawhid Jamaat. I have interviewed members of these groups. So I can tell you that they all believe in this particular cult or sect called Tawhid. But Zaharan himself, after 2016, after a big fight he had with the Sufis in Katankudi, there's an internal fight with the Muslim community. The Sri Lankan police tried to arrest him. He disappeared, he went underground, and in fact there was a warrant of arrest issued to him in a court in the east. Then he started to build the IS network. He started to speak about Syria and Iraq, about what is happening in Libya, what's happening in the Middle East. And then online he linked up with another group that was operating in Colombo. And most of those terrorists that attacked the churches and the hotels in the Western Province, they were members of that group. That is called Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Fi Silani. That is a group that was co-opted by the Islamic State. So the Islamic State, the way they operate is they are not sending Iraqi and Syrian and other foreign fighters to countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines. They co-opt local groups and they radicalize them with their own ideology. So these groups, the National Tawhid Jamaat and the Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Fi Silani, this organization, they were co-opted, and then Zaharan and the members of the JMI group, they all formed the local IS group. So Zaharan's local IS group is called Dawla Islamiyah Fi Silani. That is the Islamic State of Sri Lanka. Silani means Selendib or Serendib. This is the old name for Sri Lanka. In fact, the Arabs also use that name. So they call anyone Fi Silani if that person is from Sri Lanka. So Zaharan was known as Abu Ubaidah Fi Silani. Abu Ubaidah means he's the father of Abu Ubaidah, and then Fi Silani means he's from Sri Lanka. So IS built a network of about 160 people. So I want to tell you that since the attack, within 8 days, the Sri Lankan security forces arrested or killed those terrorists. Most of them were arrested. How come the Sri Lankan security forces moved so fast? It is because Zaharan was known to the Sri Lankan government. But he was known as a radical preacher. He was not known as a terrorist. Because Zaharan had developed mastery of operating discreetly in cyberspace. He used 2 applications. One is Telegram, which is an end-to-end encrypted application. And the other is called Threema, which is usually used by the other South Asian IS networks. It's not so common here, but one of the terrorists from Colombo introduced these capabilities to Zaharan. But Zaharan's organization itself had its own YouTube channel, had its own Facebook page. So he was quite internet savvy, because the recruitment is both in physical space and in cyberspace, but mostly in cyberspace. This is a characteristic of this group. So I want to go back again to the Middle East, go back to South Asia, and tell you a little bit about how IS is formed. I told you how Al-Qaeda is created by Bin Laden, a product of the anti-Soviet multinational Afghan Mujahideen campaign. Let me now share with you how IS is formed. When Bin Laden was in Afghanistan, that is the Al-Qaeda leader, he invited terrorist leaders from around the world to come to Afghanistan. He said, this is a base for you to train. In fact, the full name of Al-Qaeda is called Al-Qaeda Al-Sulba, meaning the solid base. And that is going to be the base where they train fighters and send them around the world to spread their version of Islam, which is very distinct from the traditional Sri Lankan version of Islam. Because the version of Islam advocated by Al-Qaeda and IS is a very intolerant form and a very aggressive form. It's very different. It's different from the Islam that came here through the traders and the scholars, which is a very peaceful form of Islam. So, one of the persons who accepted Bin Laden's invitation and traveled to Afghanistan, his name is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is the founder father of the Islamic State. It is not the current leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was a criminal. He was a rapist. He came from a village in Jordan that I had visited. Not a village, a town called Zaka. He was imprisoned, but the Jordanian king was very magnanimous. He gave a pardon to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Zarqawi was a criminal in prison, and he was radicalized by a radical cleric who was in prison called Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. In fact, to this date, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi maintains the biggest extremist terrorist website. It's hosted on American server because the Americans believe in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of demonstration. That's why I said we can't do what the Americans are doing. We'll kill ourselves. We'll destroy this country. You can't allow extremist websites. So, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi radicalized the man who later became the founder father of the Islamic State, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. They both traveled to Afghanistan, got money from Osama bin Laden and built their own training camp in Afghanistan, in Herat, very close to the Iran border. And when the Americans intervened in Afghanistan after 9/11, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi moved to the north of Iraq through Iran, through Mashhad and Tehran, and he built his base in Kurmal in Iraq. I know this because I served twice in Iraq, in the Iraqi prison system, helping them to build their terrorist rehab program. It was a very difficult time even for me because it was the most dangerous period where IS was rising. And I interviewed many IS members, detainees and prisoners. So I can tell you that what happened during that time in Iraq. I wrote 3 books based on my experience in Iraq. And the first book I wrote is called From the Desert to the World Cities, the New Terrorism. And the first chapter I wrote was it spread to Asia because Asia had a big Muslim population. So gold mine. So when Zarqawi went to Iraq, he named his group Tawheed wal Jihad. Tawheed wal Jihad. Zahra named his group National Tawheed. Same terminology. But Tawheed is not a bad word. Tawheed means the oneness of God. But you can see how much one terrorist organization, one religious group can influence another one. And this group called Tawheed wal Jihad, established by Zarqawi in Iraq. Later this group fought against the Americans because Americans went to Iraq in March of 2003, evolved through 4 stages. Tawheed wal Jihad became the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that became the Mujahideen Shura Council, and that became the Islamic State of Iraq, and Islamic State of Iraq became Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. That's why the Americans refer to this group as ISIS. But I want to tell you that the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria evolved to the Islamic State, or Dawla Islamia, on the 24th of June 2014. That is what inspired those 41 Sri Lankans to travel. That is what inspired the creation in Colombo, in the western province of this country, the network called the JMI, the Jamiatul Millati Ibrahim Fi Silani. And of course, Zaharan himself became a member of IS. So these networks were built in great secrecy, mostly using the end-to-end encrypted communication. But they also operated very openly in Facebook and other social media platforms because they want to radicalize through the net. So I have shared with you the genesis of the Islamic State. I have told you also about the founder of the Islamic State. He's a criminal. He was like Zaharan, because Zaharan also engaged in a lot of criminal activity in the East. In fact, Zaharan's group and the Sufis fought. A number of people were stabbed and injured in the East. So it was a big fight within the Muslim community between the extremists and the moderate or the mainstream Muslims. I prefer to use mainstream rather than moderate, because they are the real Muslims. You can call them also responsible Muslims, because they didn't like the ideology of Zaharan. But unfortunately, after 2015, we had a liberal government modeled very much on European thinking. So there were 5 things that happened. Because we were a country that defeated a very ruthless terrorist group. For 27 years, the Sri Lankan military, the Sri Lankan law enforcement agencies, the Sri Lankan intelligence services fought. And that fighting was not only by the Sinhalese. In fact, we had brilliant Muslim officers. We had Colonel Fazli Lafir, who was the mentor of the Special Operations Forces. I spent many days with him in the Special Forces training base in Madurai. We also had the commanding officer of the Military Intelligence Corps, Colonel Nizam Mutalif. He was killed in Colombo. I spent many days talking and working with him. They were brilliant officers. They were Muslims. One from the Malay and the other from the Moor community, but Muslims. So the Muslims supported the fight against terrorism. In fact, all the Muslims were expelled. There was ethnic cleansing by Prabhakaran from the north. They could just told, you can leave for the south with whatever you can carry. Muslim villages were attacked in the east. Brutal massacres. I myself visited the 2 mosques that were attacked in the east, the Mira Juma and the Husseiniya mosques. The LTT, after staging the first wave of attacks, the LTT terrorist went and announced, the terrorists are no more here, and asked the Muslims to come back. Then the LTT terrorists again attacked them and massacred them. So the Muslims suffered dearly. So I want to tell you that when Easter Sunday attacks happened, the Muslims supported the government, because they have always been with the government. They have always been with the state. Let me share with you why Zaharan's group, why the other networks that were IS had seeded couldn't be monitored. One is, when the new government came in 2015, they removed the roadblocks, the checkpoints. They should have never done that, because we had 11,500 rehabilitated terrorists. I myself designed that program with another colleague of mine, a psychologist, whose name I do not wish to mention. But I want to tell you that that program was an immense success. But still, we wanted the security and intelligence platform to remain. There was a grid that was created where every village, every town, even every road was covered by the intelligence service. But the security and intelligence platform was also dismantled. So one is the checkpoints were removed, other is the security and intelligence platform was removed. Next is the military was told to go to the barracks. It's a fatal mistake because the military was building roads, houses, helping the Sri Lankan Tamil people especially with agriculture, farming, fishery, computers. The interaction between the nation's army that saved this nation and the ordinary people was lost. It may be something the Western countries wanted. It may be something the minority political parties wanted. Maybe what the TNA wanted. But these were mistakes that we should have never made. I also want to tell you that a very senior and a very able Sri Lankan military officer who was a Muslim, who had the deepest expertise on Zaharan's group, he was sent overseas. I also want to tell you that 500 military intelligence officers were either arrested or they were fingerprinted and their photographs taken. And the operating wing of the Military Intelligence Corps, which is a very large organization of about 5,000 operatives, it was demobilized. The indomitable spirit that must be inculcated in the hearts and the minds of those who serve the national security sector, whether they are military, law enforcement, or intelligence, that steadfastly eroded. There's a failure of collective leadership, because in national security, you have to constantly generate intelligence, and others have to act on that intelligence immediately. It's a crime to have intelligence and not act. The Easter Sunday attacks was not a failure of intelligence. It's an operational failure to act. Intelligence was very precise. It said Zaharan, it identified his team, it identified the mode of attack, the perpetrator, the perpetrating group, the mode of attack, and also the intended target, churches and other targets. Intelligence was not shared. I visited the Kochikade church after the attack. I spoke to the fathers, I went inside. I want to see for myself what happened. And I want to tell you that the fathers, the clergy was not informed. That demonstrated the national security machinery of this great nation that had fought a terrorist campaign for 27 years was rendered impotent. It was no longer capable of detecting and neutralizing threats. Because politicians played with security and security was compromised. I have to tell you the truth, and I have told you the truth. I want to share with you my own recommendations, because since this attack, I've flown twice to Sri Lanka and met also with Sri Lankan leaders and with the operating units. And based on my own threat assessment, the imminent threat of a terrorist attack to Sri Lanka has ceased. The likelihood of a terrorist attack by IS has diminished. You can send your children to school. I would ask you not to make your hotels fortresses. I would also ask you to open the airport. But you have to go beyond that. as leaders of Sri Lanka. Because leadership is not only President and Prime Minister and ministers and parliamentarians. We need leadership at all levels. What do I mean by that? That is, the ecosystem that produced Zahran and others is still intact. The radicalization pipeline that produced those terrorists, they are still intact. So government will have to take far-reaching changes. But it is not only government, mostly community leaders, religious leaders, educators, those who can shape the minds of Sri Lankans today and tomorrow. What can we do? I have proposed 5 changes, and I want you to campaign for those 5 changes. One is, we need to criminalize hate speech and incitement to violence. If we do not criminalize hate speech and incitement to violence, this country will become like Pakistan, or maybe some parts of India, where there are regularly attacks against other communities. Hate speech is, and incitement to violence is what drove those mobs that attacked Sri Lanka after Easter Sunday, which in my view did a bigger harm, bigger damage to Sri Lanka. We must never blame the Sri Lankan security forces, especially the police. Police in any country cannot prevent a riot, except the riot police. You have to deploy the military. But the military cannot move super fast, because military is not deployed everywhere. To stop a riot is difficult. Do not ever blame the Sri Lankan security forces. They have freed this nation. They have sacrificed their lives. Don't blame them. I have seen some postings. Don't do that. Because if there is an incident even today, who will respond? It is the security forces. You have to worship them, because they saved your country. So I want to tell you, the criminalizing hate speech and incitement to violence is paramount. This doesn't apply only to the Muslim community, it applies to the Buddhist community. As a Sri Lankan Buddhist, I want to tell you, we have to apply this very strictly. Anyone who violates this should be investigated, prosecuted, and after a trial should be punished with imprisonment, confiscation of assets. If we don't do this, this country will become like a Middle Eastern country or one of those South Asian countries that we don't want to become. Because our socio-economic indices are much higher than India or Pakistan. We are more like a Southeast Asian country. We should aspire to that level of attainment. That means we must have perfect ethnic and religious harmony. That is why I said that if we learn the lessons of what happened on Easter Sunday, we can be a much stronger nation than what we were. Second is, we have to criminalize posting and hosting extremist content on the web. This is a huge problem. I have worked with a number of tech companies, even during this period, with a group of my Muslim friends. We have created a hate reporting network that is directly linked to Facebook and other technology platforms. And I want to tell you that all of you should create hate reporting units. If you see any hate on the net, inform. Facebook. Sri Lankan government will get their cyber security agencies after some time. Government moves slowly, you know. The most efficient people in this country is not government. It is the private sector. You can organize yourself. If you see hate, just report. Also report to the law enforcement authorities. At least there will be a record. I said Zaharan was known, but as an extremist preacher, not as a terrorist. Until the threat alert came. The third recommendation I have made is that we have to regulate the religious space. This I am super keen. If we don't regulate religious space, we become like a Syria. Because there are religious extremists from all denominations in this country. Christians, Buddhists, and Muslims. No preacher should be allowed to preach in this country without graduating from accredited school or university. And that preacher must pass a very basic exam. That preacher should learn about the other religions. And every 2 years, this preacher can receive a license to practice again. So that is why I said religious space must be regulated. So I ask the religious representatives here, speak to your bishop, your archbishop, speak to your Maulavis, speak to your Buddhist leaders, tell them to regulate the religious space, to prevent this descent to chaos. Let me also share with you that another component of that recommendation is that foreign preachers must be screened. We had a group of Arabs in Sri Lanka. I don't think that we need so many Arabs here. It is not going to help us. Any foreigner who wants to preach here must be thoroughly scrutinized. Has he ever insulted another religion? Has he traced us to extremist and terrorist groups? If that is so, he should be denied entry. And if he enters discreetly, he should be arrested and imprisoned, and his assets frozen and given a very long sentence and highly publicized, so that no other foreign preachers will come here linked to those groups. That is why I said the religious space must be very tightly regulated. Because today the terrorists are able to operate so effectively because they are infiltrating the religious space. Religious space is the ground for them to make headway. And we have to make that space hostile, not permissive. Right now, the religious space in this country is permissive, meaning anyone can come and operate and do what they want, they can preach. So many extremist preachers have come here. I have looked at the international blacklist of preachers, and I have contrasted it with the preachers who have come here. And I am shocked that we have allowed them to come here. I am not referring only to Muslim preachers. I am also referring to the Myanmar preacher, a man called Viratu. So I want to tell you that it should apply to anyone who insults other religions. Otherwise, it will not be just. Otherwise, it will not be fair. I also want to share with you about the Sri Lankan Muslim heritage. This Muslim heritage is a treasure. It is a piece. So I appeal to you, do not bring Arabization to this country. Arabs are only 10% of the Muslim world. And some of you have made Arabs your model. I have traveled everywhere where they speak Arabic. And I can tell you that Islam reached a pinnacle not in the Arab world. Other than the Arabs, for Muslims we have Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uyghurs, Bahasa speakers, Malay speakers, so many other languages that are spoken. Don't model yourself after Saudi Arabia. It's not going to help you. And it will not help the Muslim community in this country. So you have to treasure the Muslim heritage you got from your fathers and forefathers. Don't supplant it. Don't replace it. It's not going to help you. But this must be told not by me. It must be told by your religious leaders. I'll give you one example. There is constantly a phrase that Zaharan mentioned in his preachings. That is called Al-Wala Wal-Bara. Can any of you tell me, do you know the meaning of Al-Wala Wal-Bara? Ustaz, do you know the meaning of Al-Wala Wal-Bara? Anyone? Anyone? Yes, Al-Wala Wal-Bara. You are Ibrahim, right? What is Al-Wala Wal-Bara? Al-Wala Wal-Bara means loyalty to the state and loyalty to good things and hatred or disavowal of bad things. But Zaharan misinterpreted it. Zaharan said loyalty to Muslims and hatred to non-Muslims. So you can see how a beautiful passage in the religious text was misinterpreted by Zaharan. So many misinterpretations he made like that. So every faith has been misinterpreted. That is why we must have the right leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, and educators to provide that leadership. Let me also share with you one more aspect. Sri Lanka must create its own religious institutions to train its clerics. Must be very careful of sending its clerics to study in certain schools in Pakistan or certain schools in Saudi Arabia. For example, many who came from Medina University, they had, because these are 100% Arab countries, what they preach there is not conducive for our nation. So that is why I said we should build our own universities and our own structures to fortify that Sri Lankan Muslim heritage and identity. Should not rely too much on those institutions overseas. That means we have to regulate and make sure that the Ministry of Religious Affairs here gives a no objection certificate for anyone who wants to go and study overseas. We should have such arrangement. The Ministry of Religious Affairs should do this, but working in consultation with the relevant law enforcement and intelligence services, who will also provide a report. Has this school and university produced radicals, extremists, terrorists? What is being taught? Is it applicable? That's why I said religious space must be tightly regulated. Otherwise, we'll have a Zaharan next year also. Because the ecosystem has to change, the radicalization pipeline. Let me ask you what you can do practically. I would ask those who represent the schools, create a harmony club in your school. If you represent a temple, a mosque, create a harmony center. This morning I was at a mosque, one of the Tawheed mosques. Not one belongs to Zaharan, but another Tawheed organization. And I told them, look at the damage Zaharan has done to our country. Look at the damage he has done to the Muslim community. Look at the damage Zaharan has done to Islam the name of Islam. Some of you think that all Muslims are terrorists. Am I right? You do, right? So I want to share with you, that is Zaharan's work. Zaharan wanted that agenda. That is a part of the terrorist agenda. To create, please write, to create suspicion. To create prejudice. To create resentment. To create anger. And to create violence. This is the cycle of all terrorist groups. All terrorist attacks are done with that intention. And he succeeded to some extent because we saw the riots. So I want to share with you the Harmony Center, whether it is at a mosque, whether it is at a Buddhist temple, should invite people of other denominations. The same way the Gateway School celebrates all religions. So you lose fear of other religions. You have to do it. You have to create harmony clubs. And every mosque and temple, you should create a harmony center. Otherwise, we have failed to build the Sri Lankan nation. All our leaders have failed. The glue is coming apart. Communities are going into isolation. You see. There are few leaders who are brilliant, like our cardinal. I don't think any other religious group has a leader of that stature. I'm a Buddhist, but I want to tell you, I'm very sad. My own faith didn't produce a leader like that. I have to tell you the truth. And I don't fear telling you the truth. So we have to build the Sri Lankan nation, at least after so many years, by building those bridges, those links, those ties that have eroded. And we have to criminalize groups such as Bodubala Sena, such as Sihala Ravya, such as Mahason Balakaya. They have no place in Sri Lanka. You must not fear any of these groups. When we have fought a ruthless terrorist group and dismantled that group, why do we fear such groups? They do not deserve to operate openly. They have to be investigated, and if they violate those new laws, they have to be arrested. They do not represent the true spirit of Buddhists or the true spirit of Sinhalese. I also have to tell you, this is a Buddhist nation. You must not say this is not a Buddhist nation. It is under a Buddhist nation that the Christians have flourished, that the Muslims have flourished. I saw some minister making a statement recently and I was disappointed at the time he made that statement, because that would have angered the Buddhists even more. He didn't have a good idea of what he was doing. You must not make this mistake. Our constitution can say anything, but this is a Buddhist nation. We welcomed the Muslims who came. Our king told them to marry even Sinhala women. They married Sinhala women in Kandy. They married Tamil women in the east. But to say that it is not a Buddhist nation is wrong. It is the understanding of the Buddhists that enable the Muslims to flourish and to do so well. And I want to share with you just a small statistic that was sent to me by a Muslim friend of mine, because some of you might think that the Muslims have been discriminated in this country. It is not the case. Muslims represent 14% of India's population. But only two of India's 38 cabinet ministers, only 2 of India's 38 cabinet ministers are Muslims. But in the previous government, 6 out of 60 cabinet members were Muslims in Sri Lanka, which is more than the proportion of the island's Muslim population, 9.7. Today, 4 out of 32 cabinet ministers are Muslims, which is certainly more than their share of population. Let me also share with you, 21 out of Sri Lanka's 225 MPs are Muslims. In India, only 21 Muslim MPs in parliament out of 540 MPs. So if you look at the statistics, Muslims have done exceptionally well in this country. That is why I am pleading with my Muslim clerics who are here, and the Muslim leaders who are here, and those Muslims who will hear what I have said. You must regulate your religious space, and you must regulate your community. Otherwise, this will become a hotbed of IS. IS has already created provinces around the world. One of the provinces they created is in Afghanistan, Pakistan, called Vilayat Khorasan. And they have created Vilayat Hind in India, with Kashmir as its center. And just last week they created a Vilayat in Pakistan. And in Sri Lanka they plan to create a Vilayat As-Sailani, a province of the Caliphate. This was Zahran's dream. And if you don't regulate your space, your religious space, Zahran's dream will come true. It's a very clear message that I want to give my Muslim brothers and sisters. I also want to make use of this opportunity to send a very clear message to the Muslim political leaders. There was no riot after the attacks. For a number of days. But the people are very angered by what the Muslim politicians said. They have to speak intelligently. If they can't speak intelligently, they must not speak. So I ask the Muslim leaders who are here, tell your politicians, if they can't speak intelligently and if they speak nonsense, then not to speak. One politician said that the swords are kept to protect their women and to cut grass. This is a Montessori story. It should have never been said. I also want to tell you, there's a plan to build a Sharia university in the East. Certainly, that's a very impressive building. But this university or campus building should be dedicated as a memorial for those who were killed on Easter Sunday. All of you should campaign for it. And this campus should be a campus for all ethnic and religious groups. This campus should produce ambassadors of peace. It should produce children who will fight for peace. My heart broke when I saw those churches and also those hotels. I saw what the attacks can do. I had seen many cathedrals attacked. I, in fact, visited the cathedral in the Philippines that was attacked, another beautiful cathedral. So this is a trend of IS, global expansion. So in May of 2018, they attacked the churches in Surabaya, family suicide attack. Then a couple, husband and wife, attacked in January 2019, this year, the cathedral in Holo, in the Philippines. Beautiful cathedral. Then they attacked the churches here in Sri Lanka. These attacks will continue. These attacks are not going to stop because IS will continue to breathe among the Asian populations. Government can't control everything. It is the community leaders, religious leaders that can. And the schools. We have to have religious knowledge or comparative religion. We should make it mandatory. Sri Lanka is a country of peace and harmony. So I ask you to ensure that other, even if you have, say, Zahira College, get Buddhist monk, Christian preacher to come and preach, Hindu preacher. Very important. You may be doing it already, but all schools should do it. All madrasas should do it. In my opinion, there should be no full-time madrasas. Full-time madrasas never produced anyone productive around the world. You can have part-time madrasa. Like you have part-time Buddhist and Christian schools. We don't need that kind of institution in an environment like this, which is a plural society, where Muslims must contextualize their religion to living in a plural society. This is very important. This is a clear message for the Muslim leaders. So I believe that the religious space and the religious schools, whether it is a mosque, whether it is a madrasa, whether it is an association, all of this should be regulated by the Muslim leaders, by the Muslim institutions. But if they don't regulate it, certainly government will have to regulate it. And I would ask those who are from the schools to seriously consider religious knowledge, because all religions preach good. The spirit of all religions, the soul of all religions, is always beyond religion. It is to serve humanity. This we have to understand. When you look at Cardinal, you can say that. He immediately understood the message. And I hope other clergy will also understand this. Let me conclude this presentation by 3 projections. One is, IS has shrunk in battle space in Iraq and Syria. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the IS leader, for 5 years he didn't produce a video. He was silent after his speech in Mosul in 2014. But he appeared immediately after the Sri Lanka attack. This is a very significant attack for him, success for him. But we have to send a message to him and to other terrorists that you have made a fatal mistake by attacking Sri Lanka. How do we do that? We can do that only if we unite and work together. As communities, if we fight each other, if we point fingers at each other, if we do not create harmony centers in our mosques, in our temples, in our kovils, in our churches, if we do not share each other's food, if we do not share the golden rule of all religions. Don't do to others what you don't want to happen to you. If we don't create those common religious spaces, if we do not create the harmony clubs in those schools, both Zaharan and the man who gave him the instruction to attack the churches, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, will win the fight. So my first message is, let us unite and work together. Because we are Sri Lankans. We may be a Christian, we may be a Muslim, we may be a Buddhist, we may be a Hindu. But first, we are Sri Lankans. This is my first message to you. We have to all think beyond religion. Religion is important. But the nation of Sri Lanka is more important. Second is that you as educators have a major role to shape the future generation. When I went to school, I was taught that the Sinhalese were the most superior race. And I believed in it. But the more I traveled around the world, met other cultures and communities, I thought that I had been indoctrinated at school. That is why those who came from my school were mostly the frontline fighters and the commanders that ended the terrorist campaign, because we were indoctrinated like that. It may have been necessary at one point to do so. It is no longer necessary. Today, the indoctrination should be, we are Sri Lankans. So it was my teachers who narrated various stories from history and taught that. So I ask you to revise your curriculum, your syllabus, your content, to unite all of us. Because you produce the future. I think Gateway can do it. I don't know whether others will have the vision like you. I hope they will, at least to some extent. The third aspect I want to tell you, don't wait for our apex leaders to act. All of you are leaders in your own right. All of you, each one of you. All of you can make a change in this country. This morning, when I woke up, I looked out of my window. I saw a deserted Colombo. When I looked the other side, I saw the construction of JW Marriott and Ritz-Carlton and another building. Sri Lanka had some issues the last 5 years. But I can tell you that Sri Lanka will not be like what it was in the last 5 years, in the coming years. And I ask you, all of you, to do what you can without complaining or criticizing anyone. Don't get depressed. Don't speak of the failures. Light that one candle without complaining of the darkness. Thank you very much.